This is the Annex, a sociology podcast. I'm Joseph Cohen from Queens College.
And I'm Dan Morrison from Abilene Christian University.
Today we meet Dan Huebner from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Dan is the author of Becoming Mead, The Social Process of Academic Knowledge with the University of Chicago Press. We're going to jump into the story of one of sociology's great classical theorists. You're not going to want to miss this. George Herbert Mead is a name that I haven't spoken or heard of since my days in my classical theory class in graduate school, but there's no doubt the man is a towering figure in our discipline. He's widely credited as having founded symbolic interactionism, although I might get my background knowledge straightened up today, and a major contributor to philosophical pragmatism. His Mind, Self, and Society is a book that is said to have been written by his students' notes after his death. It's a mainstay of classical theory seminars everywhere. And for today's episode, we're going to take a deeper dive into this classical theorist with the help of Dan Huebner, a professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Dan is the author of Becoming Mead, The Social Process of Academic Knowledge with the University of Chicago Press. Welcome, Dan Huebner.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
So let's start off with some background on Mead and his Mind, Self, and Society. Many of us haven't touched this material in years, or in my case, decades. And so we might benefit from a bit of a refresher. Can you remind us, who's Mead and why is he important to sociology?
Sure. Yeah. So George Herbert Mead is an American philosopher, taught most of his career at the University of Chicago. As you said, he's a pragmatist by kind of orientation. And in sociology, he's known for this book, Mind, Self, and Society. And more generally, he's known for his theory of the social self, for the social basis of meaning and thought, for a focus on communication as kind of central to the way society works, and those kinds of things. But as I'm sure we'll get into, there's a lot more avenues, both of his writing and a lot of misconceptions about him, I think, that have developed in the social sciences.
And he's credited with starting, or at least being an originating figure of symbolic interactionism.
Right.
Can you remind us, what's symbolic interactionism?
Oh, yeah. Well, how long do you have? Symbolic interactionism is a perspective, I think, that centers, if you want to take it at its face value, the interactive process, right? This process of interpreting one another as kind of central to what it is that society consists of. And there are a lot of different versions of that. There's the, kind of Bloomerian Herbert Bloomer version. There's a more kind of structural version. And there are, let's say thousands of different little iterations of it in various forms. But that's kind of the core of it. And as you said, Mead is often thought of as the kind of founder or maybe forerunner of this process, largely because his student, Herbert Bloomer, kept bringing him in as the kind of central figure in his lineage, so to speak.
Huh. So wait a minute. You're saying Herbert Bloomer, and can you give us some background on Herbert Bloomer? Who was he?
Yeah, I was just teaching about Herbert Bloomer today in my theory class. So
good. It's
fresh. I can do this. Yeah. An American sociologist who was trained at the University of Chicago and then taught there for much of his early career, and then moved to Berkeley, where, as I understand it, he was kind of the central, almost founding chair of the sociology program at UC Berkeley. And he's known for a lot of things, and I think he's been especially reappraised after his life for things that I think people didn't realize he had written about. But the kind of core of his approach is this term and this perspective, symbolic interactionism, that tries to, as I said, center this interpretive process in society. But he was also a football player, and he was also apparently a male model at one point. And there's just lots of interesting little anecdotes that still get spread at these symbolic interactionist meetings about Herbert Bloomer. He's kind of everybody's favorite subject of a story or something like that.
It's interesting. I was on the topic of how your students sort of do a lot to ensure your legacy. I remember exchanging some words with who was doing David Kalnitsky and Michael McCarthy, I think, are putting together a volume in honor of Eric Olin Wright. And, I was saying, it's very interesting. All the sociologists who we know of today are basically people who had students who sort of put the elbow grease into doing something to memorialize their mentor's work. I guess it's a testimony to how important your students are to your legacy.
Yeah, I mean, that's central to why we even know who Mead was and why he's taught in sociology. I have a line that sometimes gets quoted from my book, which is, Mead's remembered in a discipline he didn't teach in for a book he didn't write. And the fact that that's correct, that that's true, only is true because he had students in sociology who kept bringing him back into the discussion. Especially Herbert Bloomer, but others we could talk about as well. So yeah, there's this kind of central place for the work done by students to memorialize their mentors, which then raises questions about whose mentors get to carry the day. And I think it tells you a lot about institutional centrality and strength of social networks to really think about, if everyone has a mentor, which are the ones we still remember?
Yeah. I mean, there's plenty of mentors, not naming any names, but there's plenty of famous mentors whose own work I'm like, I don't even understand it. I'm like, this is not comprehensible in any way, shape, or form. But we'll save that for another episode, I guess.
So you need people who not only bring you back into the conversation, but interpret you in a way that other people can kind of grab hold of and find meaningful. Right? So there's a lot of this kind of rhetorical work of trying to make yourself relevant so that other people will care.
Yeah.
Right?
Or perhaps reinterpret your work as something that could be accessed by the rational mind or the.
Yeah, I'm not sure that those are ever fully separable processes of whether we're really saying just another version of what they said or whether we're saying something different as if it were what they said. Right?
I'm really curious, Dan Huebner, about Mead as a pragmatist, Mead as a public intellectual. That was part of the book that I was really fascinated by. And that's not the story that I had received in my, graduate training or just my understanding of his work. And so, it's something that I'm interested in my own academic work is the relationship between pragmatism and symbolic interactionism and the broader discipline. And right now there's a lot that sociologists could comment on. But how did you think about, or how did you understand what Mead was trying to do as a public intellectual in Chicago, primarily when he was teaching at U of C?
Yeah, I think that in a sense we learn some of these figures the wrong way around. So if you hand someone the book Mind, Self, and Society, then the instant image that you have, even if you know that this is based on lecture notes, maybe especially if you know this is based on lecture notes, is that this is a guy who spent his whole life sitting in ivory towers or rather classrooms, just talking about ideas. And I think that that's just not, that doesn't tell you anything about where these ideas came from. And for me, this is the kind of key element of thinking about someone like Mead as a public intellectual. His ideas came from real engagement with reform projects. So I think it's key to think about him as a public intellectual, Mead as a public intellectual. And so one of the things that I started to discover was a lot of his published work began as speeches in front of reform organizations. He was the president of the City Club of Chicago. He officially represented the territory of Hawaii at a national farmland conference. He gave speeches about advocating a representative and elected school board in front of thousands of people. I mean, this is someone who was really trying to make a difference on a huge range of what we would now think of as the progressive era reforms: education, juvenile justice, workers' rights, women's suffrage, international peace, social settlements, prison reform, public transit and public ownership of utilities. All are things that he had something to say in front of the public, so to speak.
So is he like the classical public sociologist in a way?
I mean, they all kind of were in this pre-professional generation. I think that, you can't think about people like Jane Addams or W.E.B. Du Bois or any of these people without thinking about them as necessarily also public intellectuals or public sociologists. In that sense, the work of, Burawoy, since you mentioned public sociology, is an attempt to, I think, reclaim some of that pre-professionalism, that engagement with the world at large, so to speak, instead of just the classroom.
For those of us who aren't as strong in the history of sociology, which would be me, because I'm sure Daniel Morrison's pretty up on stuff, like, what do you mean by the pre-professional era of sociology?
Yeah, I tend to draw the line starting about World War One. That's where for me, prior to World War One is a kind of pre-professional period, and World War One and thereafter, really after the war ends, becomes a professionalization period. And that's especially true after World War II. But even in the 1920s and 30s, you can see the development of standardized methodologies, more emphasis on rigor and doing methods instead of just going out and observing and experiencing the social world. You have a lot more of this kind of setting down standards for what the discipline should look like and differentiating it from anthropology, psychology, and all the other things that we would want to be not the same as.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. Well, so wait, but before was the work of a scholar basically just like a smart guy and you didn't know what was going on with him? It was like a secret sauce, some genius that he was supposed to project, or?
Yeah, I don't think so, because there were still, if you were taking Meads classes, for example, you were taking them in the philosophy department, right? So there already were these different departments. So there was this nascent development of disciplines, but you were going to hear a smart guy talk about his experience of the world, in a sense, or a smart woman or whoever. And I would emphasize again, he was a philosopher, and yet his biggest influence has been in sociology. So there's this moment where it was possible to take philosophy classes like Herbert Bloomer was doing, and then teach them as sociology classes, and teach them as ideas for the social sciences.
I mean, I think it is a really fascinating question about how we get what shape disciplines take today, and how the lines were blurred, earlier. One question that does come to mind, specifically about Mead's engagement with Hawaii, is, are there connections between his conceptualization of his academic work and what was happening in Hawaii, the questions of colonization and governance for that space, and then of course his personal relationship with the folks who were very powerful and influential, white folks in Hawaii.
Can you preface that answer by also just giving us a little background on how we got to Hawaii and the whole Hawaii story?
Yeah, so the first thing to say is most people don't think of Hawaii when they think of Mead, right? And I think that that's wrong. And if you want the full story of that, you should check it out, because I've written about it. Jean-Francois Coté at Montreal has written about it, and a few others have written about this more recently. But so the background is Mead's best friend in college was Henry Castle, and Henry Castle's sister, Helen Castle, would ultimately become Mead's wife. So the two people that he knew best in college and thereafter were the Castles, two children of a missionary family, white missionary family that had gone to Hawaii and made a fortune on the production of sugarcane, other fruits, and a shipping company. So here Mead is being introduced kind of secondhand to colonial Hawaii, or at this time it was still a kingdom of Hawaii, through his best friends. And he marries into this family, and he becomes kind of a member of this family that then travels almost every year. Mead traveled 13 times to Hawaii and spent an average of 2 to 3 months a year there. So this is a guy who spent many years of his life in some form traveling to and from, talking about, thinking about issues of Hawaii. And this is precisely the period, so we're talking 1880s through Mead dies in 1931, where it's the whole period of American colonization almost. It's the period when the native monarchy is overthrown with the help of U.S. military troops. It's run then as a independent republic by these white settler families. It appeals for annexation to the United States government. It becomes a U.S. territory. It's this whole period that we're talking about, and Mead's right in the center of this, seeing all of it unfold. So there's an awful lot going on here. So what was Mead doing? Well, he was touring the agricultural conditions on the plantations owned by the castles. He's seeing the native populations who are either marginalized or are being brought in as workers, kind of like almost like what's the word? Oh, what's the word?
I mean, you're not talking about sharecroppers or like indentured servants or anything.
Yeah, I mean, like
that. I mean, we're not talking about slaves here. We're talking about people who are compensated for their labor, but not well compensated for their labor.
That's right. We're talking about people who are laborers but not well compensated. Exactly. And we're also seeing a period of massive immigration to Hawaii from East Asia, from Japan and China, especially up until the early 1880s, when that becomes no longer possible because of U.S. government intervention. But by the time that Mead is aware of Hawaii as a thing, there's a larger population of people who are immigrants from East Asia than there are native Hawaiians in the islands. So there's this just eruption of social issues that he's in the center of. He advocates on behalf of annexation in front of groups in Chicago, in Hawaii, and elsewhere. His family-in-law, his in-laws, are kind of the center of this pro-annexation movement, which was, by the way, the progressive position for white progressives at this time. If you thought of yourself as a white progressive, what you wanted to do was colonize Hawaii, which is now, things have changed so much. We think so much about like sovereignty and native rights that I think that's
right.
It's really strange to think about that as the progressive position. It required me to really think about how is it that Mead, knowing this about Mead, changes, our thought process. Do we have to recontextualize him? Do we have to think about him as not, he's sometimes called the radically democratic intellectual. He's the person, he's the Democrat. You can always hold him up as the guy who was like in favor of more democracy. And now we have to rethink that because he's in favor of colonization.
So progressivism in those days, was it this idea of bringing progress to like backward societies? It was like elevating them from like whatever backwardsness that they live in into some more enlightened Western type of living standard or lifestyle, or is that the basic thrust of it?
I mean, it's certainly one of the central pieces of progressivism as it applies to places like Hawaii. If you were, as I said, a white American progressive, your understanding of this place was a place that needed to be brought up to a standard of self-governance. And the way to ensure that was to annex it, was to turn it into an American territory, because America was the head of the progressive movement. And if you then brought it into that, then you would progressivize this people, something like that. But Mead was also very aware of people who were pointing out that this was having a detrimental effect on the native populations. People were losing out on their ways of life, on their, their folkways, their traditions, their food, their, everything that made this society fit together. And he's aware of all of that, and yet he's still in the middle of advocating this. So I just think it requires us to think more of these people as people, right? As people with complicated involvements in their social worlds, rather than as just like ideals or concepts or something.
Can you think of a story that really stuck with you about Mead's time in Hawaii, or the legacy of it?
I mean, the things that I always go back to is Mead was an avid mountain climber. And so the best stories of Mead in Hawaii are of him on these mountain hikes. He did them over and over while he was in Hawaii because I guess he just loved the scenery. He loved the exposure to these environments. And he would invariably fall or get injured or whatever. This happened to him something like 4 times because you can find it in the newspapers. This was apparently a big enough deal that it was covered in the newspapers. Chicago professor falls on hike. And there are pictures
for
of
fourth time.
Yeah, for 4th time. That's
right. Chicago professor fails to learn lesson.
Yeah, exactly.
Falls 4th time.
Like somebody in Hawaii is like, what the hell's wrong with this guy?
Right.
Anyhow, sorry.
And so this is just kind of like central to the way that he clearly experienced this place. And not only that, it was clearly central to his introduction to the politics of Hawaii. So on these hikes, he's being led around by the local elites, the white ruling class, so to speak, of this place, including people like the provincial governors or the territorial governors. And it's this exposure that then gets him hired more or less to be the official delegate to the National Farmland Congress in the United States on behalf of Hawaii, a place that he just incidentally knows because of his family, his in-laws. He's now officially representing and telling people to go and farm in Hawaii, right, and providing them with statistics and telling them what farming is like, even though he's never been a farmer.
What an odd gig.
Yeah, it's an odd gig.
Or like, why would you do something like that? Or just like do favors? Or
I guess it was a favor. I guess it was a favor to the territorial governor, Walter Freer, at the time, who, if your farmland congress is in the contiguous United States, the continental United States, you can't just send any old person from Hawaii there, right? It would cost you too much. So if Mead's already there in Chicago, you just have him as your delegate.
It's okay. That's more comprehensible as a faculty member at CUNY. That's sort of how it goes. It's like, while you're in that country, can you take care of some official business?
Exactly.
One of the fascinating things about Mead and his kind of profile, how we talk about him today, at least before your book, was that Mead never wrote anything. He very rarely published. He just, for some reason, it's sort of like publication fright or stage fright, although not in his case, not literally. But your book really reveals that he actually had a great deal of writings that were published, but also that he had, and I would like to hear you talk about this, he had a lot of experience in what were the most up-to-date kind of scientific methods that he picked up in Germany doing these experiments with animals. This whole idea of reaction, he studied reaction times. I mean, I think about some of Dewey's stuff with the reflex arc and those sorts of ideas. So I'm just curious about what you can say about Mead, the writer, and Mead, the scholar who actually did have a lot of work published. He was published in AJS, right? I mean, so this is really a two-parter. One, okay, so tell us about what Mead did publish, and secondly, what can you tell us about why we think Mead didn't publish anything?
Yeah. So I think there's actually 3 parts because there's the research part also.
Yes.
But, so let me start with that one actually, because so the research thing, one of the things that I try to expose in Becoming Mead is that Mead was not someone who just invented these ideas out of nowhere. And he didn't just invent them from his kind of casual interactions in society. It's not like he came up with these ideas just because he happened to be a member of society. He had a whole, training as a graduate student and elsewhere, early career, doing psychophysical experiments. So he, in labs in Germany and then at the University of Michigan, where he's hired to take over the psychology lab, he is, as you said, doing reaction time experiments. So he's trying to determine how long it takes people to perceive differences of time or sound or weight or whatever. These kind of very classical 19th century psychology experiments. And throughout all of this, he's also realizing that no matter how well you calibrate your equipment, no matter how rigorous you are, you can't get rid of the fact that there is this kind of social interpretive process going on here. And I think that that's also the insight that, as you said, Dewey has when he starts thinking about the reflex arc, how we have to ground all of this in a kind of action process or a social action process. And it's no coincidence that it's the two of them there at Michigan in the 1890s who start to figure this out together, right? This is where functional psychology becomes a school of thought. This is where Dewey and Mead invent this new branch of pragmatism that then gets carried into the social sciences, right? They have such an influence basically because of this, because of the problems of doing psychological experiments. It's a really kind of core aspect of this that we often ignore. And he's cutting up brain specimens, and he's doing experiments on cats, and there's a whole bunch of stories of Mead doing this stuff in the 1890s. So there's that. But then on the writing side of things, Mead, so there is this one volume, the Selected Writings, which has something like, 25 of his published essays. But if you look at a comprehensive bibliography of Mead, and you account for things like all of the proceedings volumes and editorials and all of the other things that he did, you find that that list is well over 100 items. So he's someone who wrote an awful lot, and not always for publication. In fact, he was often writing for himself, it seems. That's why at his death, they found so many of these kind of manuscripts that were half written, because he just seemed to constantly be writing to think out ideas. And he was often writing at the behest of people around him. So someone would say, I need an essay on social psychology. Can you write this for my next journal edition? Right? And he would just be like, okay, apparently. He would just say, yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, no problem. I got it. Anybody need a medical article or?
Which sounds a little flippant, but
yeah.
Because as Dan was saying, Dan Morrison, the image we have of him is as someone who we needed Mind, Self, and Society, which was published after his death, because he never wrote anything in his life, which is of course not true, as I just said. And so the way that we get to that place is, it is clear Mead was continually trying to revise his own ideas. So I think he had trouble giving up on ideas. I try to document a few cases in my book where people like John Dewey noticed that Mead would be perpetually late on turning in articles because he was never quite done with them. He was never satisfied enough with the wording of them. So this is where I think this myth gets started of Mead as a kind of diffident writer, Mead as someone who couldn't really get the words out or something like that. There's some truth to that, but that didn't stop him from actually having things published. Now, it is true also that he never wrote a book length anything in his life. And any attempt that was made during his life to try to publish something that was a book attributed to him he was always trying to get rid of it, trying to make it not happen. You can see cases of that in his life.
Why?
I think that it stems from this same, I don't want a system that's done. I want to be always rethinking these ideas, able to kind of add to them. And if I have a book that's like my philosophy, then it's done. It's over. It's a system. It's self-enclosed. And that prevents it from being novel and engaging or changeable or something like that. So, yeah. So then the last element is, how do we end up with Mead as this person that we think of as not a writer? And it's people like Dewey after his death giving eulogies saying Mead never wrote anything. And then that becomes this idea that maybe we need to memorialize Mead. And in order to memorialize Mead, we kind of have to build up this myth that there isn't enough Mead out there yet. So we need to publish something of Mead's. And so there's this whole kind of process that kind of builds on itself, where all of a sudden we end up with, oh, well, now we think there is no Mead and we need a Mead, and here's the Mead that we can create after his death. So I think it's all part of the process of creating a legacy for him.
It's like the typical jazzing up the book by the
right.
only one of its kind or whatever. First of all, I'm sure there are a lot of the more lightly published among us are probably pretty disappointed to hear that Mead was prolific, because you're like, oh, rats.
Yeah. Well, you can hold on to the
'Cause-
fact that he never wrote a book in his life, and that he never actually had a graduate degree. So there's that too.
Oh, nice.
I mean, one of the things that does strike me about Mead is, his whole thing is about process, right? It's about ongoing, unfolding lines of action. And it strikes me that it makes sense that if your the core of your idea is things are never finished, right? And that's part of the pragmatic move also, is just to say we're sort of moving towards, increasingly good relations between, this part of society and that part of society, or this bit of social reform and this kind of outcome, right? And so, my understanding of pragmatism is no one would say, okay, we're finished with pragmatism, right? We're finished with our ongoing adjustments to changes in the unfolding of history, right? And so I know it humanizes Mead, and to me anyway, to hear you say, like, he didn't want to let go of the very core nub of his idea, which is that, things change and will continue to change, and we're all in processual relationship, like inside ourselves, and also in relation to our, our neighborhoods, our communities, our state, our time and place.
Yeah, I think
Maybe
that
I don't know
makes
if you
sense.
agree with that, but that helps me think it through.
It certainly does. I think so.
So why does Mead matter today in sociology? It's a great backstory, classic guy, lots of color, but why does he matter in all seriousness to sociology today?
Yeah, so some classics age better than others, I think. And one of the things and we're continually trying to figure that out. We're reappraising over the course of time who we need to look back to. And in a sense, the argument that I and others have been making is we need to look back to Mead, not just because the social self is an interesting idea or something like that, but also because we have forgotten that he wrote about a whole bunch of other stuff that's still of relevance to us, and maybe even more relevant to us nowadays. So things like he wrote about the co-constitution between organisms and their environment, or between society and environment, well before that was a general topic that we now think about, environmental sociology or something like that. And some people have started to really use his ideas that build on the notion of the social self, but also incorporate the environment as social objects to be oriented toward. Right now, we have to take into account the role of the environment around us. Right? That's a really interesting way of reinterpreting Mead. But also things like, digital media allows us to think about self-presentation, the social self, in a different way. But also, if we have issues with deliberative democracy, Mead is one of the first people to really articulate what does democracy look like if it's not just a model of society, but an ongoing way of communicating and understanding one another, right? Along with Jane Addams and a few others, John Dewey of that generation. And he's someone who is now being brought into the literature on embodied cognition, which is a very hot topic in psychological sciences. And he's being brought into work on material cultures like archaeology. I just started to discover this for the last couple decades, especially in Britain. There have been reinterpretations of classical American pragmatists as relevant to contemporary archaeology. And I guess the way to think about that is how our material remains they don't have their meanings contained within themselves. They have their meanings in relation to the uses that we make of them, in relation to the kind of contextual interpretations we make of them. And Mead's someone who was saying that 100 years ago. Right? So over and over, I think what we're finding is new ways in which classics like Mead become relevant. And maybe the last thing that I'll say on this is coming back to the kind of Buravoy point that we made before, which is if we are looking for a more engaged social science, then maybe we can look back to models of what that looked like, what has and hasn't worked, what we do want and don't want from the past of our own disciplines. So if Mead was an engaged social scientist or something like it, then maybe we can look back to him for what cues we can take.
I have a question for you. It's not on Mead specifically, but on a lot of classical theorists. Sometimes, this is more in terms of Marx. I often wonder if a lot of the classical theorists whose works we mine for ideas and we celebrate for like their theoretical minds have really attained that position because they had a certain social status in their era. Like they were prominent in their time. Like, would Marx still be big if he wasn't part of the communist movement of his day or the socialist movement of his day, right? Would we still celebrate him that much? And sometimes I wonder, what's your opinion on this? Do you think that the works carry people's reputation in and of themselves, or do we? Does the success or the stature in their era sort of make them worth studying? And so we mine their works to get a sense of the success that produced those works, like the worldly success that led to those works. Does that question make sense?
Yeah.
It's always
my answer is maybe not going to be satisfactory because I think it's going to be kind of either a both or neither kind of response.
Typical scholarly answer.
Yeah. But let me try to explain what I mean. I think it's neither the works nor the context that is what we are interested in. We are interested in both of those things, but we're interested in the stuff in our present. So this is, I'm going to put a little aside here that says, this is me also thinking through some of Mead's ideas that we'll come to in a second. But we are oriented toward the practical problems of our contemporary moment, right? Whatever we are interested in because they're problems of our society. And so when we look back to these classic authors, we're interested in the ideas, we're interested in the context, we're interested in whatever we can take as tools that help us understand ourselves, ultimately. And yeah, so as I said, that's kind of an either or neither or both kind of response. But I think that that's, in a sense, the more kind of honest or at least pragmatic response to this way of thinking.
Truthfully, it's a good answer. It's the best answer possible, right? Like that makes complete sense to me, rather than some simplistic either or.
Yeah, I guess I'm just personally really fascinated by this question about how, these classical authors really speak to contemporary moments. I'm teaching the one social theory class that's taught at my university right now, and I have them read just little pieces of Du Bois and the Souls of Black Folk, right? And the student, they're blown away because they read into this work that was published, I think, in 1903. Don't quote me on that.
Yeah, no, but
right. Then quote me in 1903. This 1903 text, and they're saying he's talking about microaggressions. He's talking about, what has happened with, he's not talking about police killings, but he's talking about the social dynamics that certainly make police killings thinkable, make them understandable. And so in my context, I'm often thinking about, how can we apply these theorists and really, write to our student newspapers and say, hey, here's a sociologist who, was thinking about how, social statuses and positions in hierarchies, lead us to be ignorant or blind to these forces that our fellow citizens are experiencing. And I guess I'm really just fascinated, and Mead is sort of a model along with Du Bois, right? To bringing that kind of scholarship to the public in a really accessible way. It sounds like he was an active, researcher in the field, in the sense that he was like going to the settlement houses. He was, observing the life of new Americans in Chicago, and he's trying to help other people understand sort of the origin of those folks, how they're understanding their society they've been dropped into, and then trying to sort of plot a way forward. I think there are issues with that, right?
Sure.
And I guess that's that's the thing that I'm curious about. To what extent did Mead take this sort of like noblesse oblige kind of perspective when he was talking to these audiences in Chicago, or to what extent was he trying to do something else, right? With those groups.
Yeah, so let me say a couple of things. First, I wanted to think a little bit about, teaching a classical theory class or something like that. And I have the same experience, which is one of the central things I often find myself having to do, kind of necessarily so, is explaining why this stuff is relevant. And so if a lot of the effort that we have to undertake, why are we teaching this segment of Marx or this segment of Du Bois or this segment of whatever? A lot of what we have to do is do the work already of articulating what do we take from them? What is the problem that they speak to of our society, right? So it's already this kind of pragmatic orientation toward these authors. And for me, it's very much connected with things like, why did you select this set of readings to expose to your students, right? Why are these the things they need to know? And parentheses, not a whole bunch of other things, because the late 19th, early 20th century, when we're teaching this period as the classical period, it's a whole bunch of other stuff was written, right, that we don't want them to prioritize, right? There's a whole bunch of, just to take the most obvious examples, there's a whole bunch of like eugenics stuff that like we don't assign in classical theory, although in the early 20th century, that was thought of as central to social science in many ways. So, we're doing this work of interpreting and reinterpreting continually. And so I just think that that's really a central thing we should acknowledge and do more self-consciously, self-reflectively. And yeah, maybe that's all that can be said there. But
although on the eugenics thing, like, I don't know what the value would be of mining their text, right? Like, just the mere fact that they exist is probably sufficient. You're like, okay, this is what they believed.
But then, but then we don't want to forget that existed and it was a blind alley, right? We don't want us to go down this route in all but name again and then realize later, oh, whoops, we did it again, right? Although we are...
That's very fair.
Yeah, look, that's a whole other aside. We can argue about whether we're already doing that or not, but we don't want to encourage that, let's say.
Or we can avoid it at all.
Yeah.
I would personally find it very daunting to engage 100-year-old, piece of work that everybody in your discipline has read. How do you find something new? Like, what do you do? So, like, to somebody who wants to take your path, wants to dig into classical theory and enhance our understanding of it, like, what do you do? How do you go about doing this? What's your method here?
My method is try it and see what there is. So, again, I don't know. Maybe that's too pragmatic in a sense, but the first thing that I do if I'm really interested in some topic, I try to find out what are the archival materials, what are the primary sources that are there, and I just start reading some of it. This is true even of the Mead project. This started as a class paper where I needed to have some kind of a paper on a theorist. And my advisor at the time was Andrew Abbott at Chicago. And he said, there are these Mead papers in the archives. Why don't you just go see what there is? And of course, that raised way more questions than it had answers in it. And that was the whole start of this. But anyway, the point is just go and see. And maybe that's not a very encouraging thing in some respects. So let me say a couple things about that. One is I recognize that is daunting.
Yes.
And that there's no guarantee of success. So in that way, it's not like a recipe for getting the right answer or anything like that. But what's so exciting, if you can get into historical sources, if you can get into archives, it is endlessly engrossing. Every new page that you turn you just never know what you're going to find. And all of a sudden you're going to find the thing you never knew you needed to know, but now becomes central to what you want to know about next, right? It's this process of just discovery at its most basic that scientists and historians have in common in this sense. I just find it endlessly fascinating.
So you're saying just get into the source materials, like identify where they are and just start reading.
Yeah.
and just immerse yourself. Is that the piece of advice? Is that the advice you're giving, more or less?
That's the advice. I mean, as I said, it's not a quick fix. It's not the way to get the answer fast, but it's the way to get really interested.
And then what? How do you go about doing a project like this? It's so foreign to someone like me, who's a survey researcher, right? Like, you're faced with the sea of evidence, and you're like, oh, here's an 80-year span of a person's life. Like, how do you zero in? How do you know what to zero in on? How do you know how to organize this? Like, what's the techniques?
Yeah, the techniques are things like timelines and spreadsheets, and the things that allow you to then organize and compare and contrast. But so that on that more kind of basic level, but ultimately it's guided by the literature, it's guided by your interests, it's guided by what are the gaps, what are the things that aren't known, where are you led in your line of questioning. So in that sense, there isn't the kind of pre-established route for these kinds of things. And maybe that's generally true of working in primary sources, because kind of by definition, you don't really know what it is until you've found it.
It's a far cry from us hypothesis testers. It's a whole other thing.
But I actually hear a lot of resonance with, the tradition that I'm familiar with, and I came up in, which is the Anselm Strauss grounded theory kind of method, which is, you come into the field with a set of orienting, vague questions or a set of interests, and then you see what's there. You ask questions, you hang out with people, you write a lot, you sort of try to tease out, what do I think is going on? Why did this thing happen? You do these critical incident memos, maybe. You sort of start to track patterns of interaction over time. And, you're not so much guided by, okay, so this theory says this thing, it has these implications. I'm going to go test to see whether those really exist in the world or not. But you do get a more, again, we're going to bring up process. You do get a more processual, action-oriented and meaning and richly meaningful set of data that you can then analyze. So I think there are some commonalities with some other methods that I've used and that folks are probably familiar with. Anselm Strauss is another person who has been memorialized. There's a Festschrift, and then he has a whole line of students. My mentor Monica Casper was one of his last, if not his last, student at UCSF. So I'm one of those people who really enjoys figuring out where I sort of sit in the lineage and all of these different folks.
I would just react to this idea that there's a lot of commonality between kind of like field research or something like that and archival research. And I think that that's not incidental. In some ways, I treat an archive as a kind of field. And I do a lot of that same articulation of, or kind of iterative process of trying to figure out what it is that I'm after. And the contemporary works like the work, who did that? Timmermans and Tavori and Timmermans on the abductive analysis. They explicitly say this kind of field research is also very much like historical research. They try to draw a lot of those connections. Just one other aside, Anselm Strauss was one of the people who helped construct this contemporary view we have of Mead. In the 1950s and 60s, he was the person starting to put together readers of sections of Mind, Self, and Society. Right? So it would be little excerpts from Mind, Self, and Society that now are kind of the sections we all have to know. The notion of the I and the me, the self and the body, right? Those kinds of distinctions. He's the person who's quite literally putting together the readers.
Yeah, I got a copy right behind me, actually.
So one last question before we go on, and this might be great for both of you, seeing how you're both very theoretically inclined. If you were to give advice to an early career or grad student who is really interested in pursuing, a career that is focused on historical and classical theory, this is something that a lot of us in our schools were discouraged from doing. As opposed to going out and getting that NSF grant or whatever. What advice or encouragement would you offer like-minded earlier career people?
I would say convince people that you can teach theory classes, because, if you're thinking about this as a very practical, like, how do you get a job from the work that you do in grad school? The way you get a job is you convince people that you can teach the kinds of things that they need taught, that you can research the things that will excite graduate students, right? So you have to do that work. And I think that was actually hard. I think it's hard for all of us that do this kind of work to do that. Like, in some ways, I think of myself as a historical sociologist, and that's not going to get me many job offers. But teaching a theory class, every department has to have at least one theory class taught. And maybe that's a little too practical of advice, but that's where my mind went. Convince people you can teach theory.
No, I think that's great advice. I think the other thing, I brought to mind a friend of mine wrote a dissertation that she recently published into a book, and it's about a body of water in Russia. And so, not a topic that I didn't describe it in the sexiest way, but not a topic that just jumps out at people. It's like, oh yeah, that's exactly relevant to the contemporary debates in American sociology, right? And she did ethnography. She went there and she hung out with the people and lived in this giant apartment building. Anyway, the point being, she had a project that was unique, where the contribution was clear, even though it came from maybe out of left field. But also, I think she did a great job of cultivating relationships both among her faculty. This is at Vanderbilt, but also across the discipline. So she was this is not a careerist or overly strategic thing, but she was just one of those people who took the risk of talking to folks, of sharing ideas, was a really good academic citizen, and she was able to get a tenure stream job at a very well-known university. And I just think, this business is definitely built in part on relationships, on showing up and being a good citizen, not stabbing people in the back, just being the kind of person that you would want as a colleague, and showing that you have those kinds of relational skills early in your career can be helpful. Nothing is going to guarantee you an academic job. I don't care what you do or where you go, and today's conditions are bad. But I think that said, I do think there are things that, even with a dissertation that maybe doesn't scream like the next big wave of sociological thought, you can do things that help increase your viability long term in the career.
Yeah. That's great advice. That's all great advice. On the first piece of advice, know that you can tell people you can teach theory. It's like the running a social department is like a business. You got roles to fill, and a lot of it is probably. I was telling a junior colleague that getting a tenure track job is like getting married. You really just have to sucker one person into it, and you're good. So it's just a question of maybe stumbling on somebody a department who has a retiring theorist and holds theory in high esteem, and they just want to sort of keep that legacy going. I wonder on Dan Morrison's thing about the networking. It can't be the networking, but sometimes it's just the people who network are just genuinely interested and engaging. And, they're just curious and they like talking to other academics. Like, I find that's part of the reason why I like being an academic. You just get to meet smart people and have sort of interesting chats with them. And even if you don't connect to the right people, it's just a great disposition. Like when you're on the other side of a hiring committee and someone's like, engaging, has great stories, whatever, you're like, I'd like to hear more from this person. Like what a live mind, what an engaging mind. So could be good. Anyhow, it was a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks so much.
You've been listening to The Annex, a sociology podcast. Thank you to Daniel Huebner from UNC Greensboro, His book is Becoming Mead, The Social Process of Academic Knowledge with the University of Chicago Press. Thank you, Dan Huebner. And also a very, very special thank you to Dan Morrison from Abilene Christian University. It was great co-hosting with you, and what a super topic. Thank you for this. We're on the web, theannexpodcast.com, on Twitter @SociAnnex, and on Facebook, the Annex Sociology Podcast. Music by Lena Orsa. The Annex is a production of the Queen's Podcast Lab. For more, visit us at queenspodcastlab.org. I'm Joseph Cohen. Thanks for listening.